Welcome to Old Path Ministries. Today we are looking at the second part in our Talking Points series on the covenants that God makes with man. In our last one, if you had a chance to view it, it is the one that God made with Abraham. And in the one that we look at today, it's the one that happens through the law and with Moses. And if you got a chance to see the last one, you'll notice that I had said that all three of the ones that we'll be looking at are tied together. They're not independent because they're all related in the people to whom they were given and the chronology, if you will, from Abraham then to Moses and then to the one that Jesus did. You'll notice that there are things that are brought up even in the book of Exodus that look back to the one that God had made with Abraham, because again, they were related. And so with Abraham, it was to a people and to a land. And what we see in the person of Moses and ultimately really with Joshua of bringing them into the land, the one that we'll examine today, is how they were going to be governed when they came into the land. And remember what we had said, that with Abraham, it was promised that you would have generations that would come from you and that they would occupy this land that you're in. And we remember that in Abraham's life, that never actually took place. So though he was given the family, we do know that part happened. He was given Isaac, and then Isaac from Abraham to Isaac, and then Isaac to Jacob. We know that in the person of Jacob that he had the sons that he did, and those were the sons by whom the tribes of Israel had come. So remembering back, if you didn't get a chance to, it's probably best if I just refer you back to part 1 of this. But from Genesis chapter 15, we know that not only did God say that he was going to do so and that he was going to give him generations, but in that he even says that those people that will come from your family line are going to have 400 years that they're going to stay in a foreign land, and then God would bring them back. So even to Abraham, God forecasted what would be hundreds of years of history that would have to occur before they would ever come back into the land. So it's very, very important for us to know that by the time that all of that has taken place and they're finally taken from Egypt, we're going to remember that it says in chapter 2, in fact, you can start moving your way there in Exodus chapter 2. We're going to start there today. And that is where it brings back into recollection that he had made the promise to Abraham and that he was going to begin the process of the fulfillment of that. So that helps us to really tie the first two very much together. And then you're going to notice in the 24th chapter of Exodus, some of the wording that is there is so very reminiscent of what we'll see in the third part of this when we look at the covenant in the person of Jesus. So in the big picture, what we have is the one made with Abraham initially, chapters 12, chapter 15 in particular in the book of Genesis, where God says initially to him in Ur of the Chaldees, long before he ever steps foot into what is modern day Israel that was promised to him, we see that God says he wants to make a great nation out of him, and that through him the nations of mankind, well beyond just the Jewish people, that the nations would be blessed. We understand that is it's alluding to the person of Jesus Christ, because the only way that God could bless mankind through the children of Abraham would be if a Messiah or someone who could be a savior to the entirety of the world. That's the only way that the nations, plural, it means the generations of man, that they could in fact be blessed. So it covers so much said in just a couple of very simple verses at the beginning of chapter 12 that really it's with us in our hindsight that we can look back and even get a glimpse of what that could possibly mean. To Abraham, it would have been something very much, I guess you could kind of say, fanciful. And when you get to that passage in chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, when it starts to talk about all of the people that were in God's history and the chronology of his people, it talks about how all of these people saw the promises of God afar off, but they never actually saw them realized in their lifetimes. But nonetheless, God had the plan to make them happen in a particular time, and so every promise that he had made to them came to pass. Only several of them, or only some of them still are left to be fulfilled, and that is ultimately the kingdom of God when it comes to earth. There aren't really a whole lot of the promises God made to people like Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to Moses and all those people that haven't been fully realized already. So we'll get into that. Let's turn then to Exodus chapter 2. That's where we're going to begin today. And we want to look in particular at verse 23 as we begin this. So here is where immediately before we're even introduced much to the person of Moses and really all that he was going to do, it's predicated on this. The time had come when God was going to begin to enact all of the events necessary to make good on the promise that he had made to Abraham of a people and of a nation. So we get that in verse 23. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of their bondage. And they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of their bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God then remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Now, let's be very, very careful that we don't look at it strictly in the English here like God came to some point in time and goes, oh, that's right, that promise that I made to Abraham, how had I forgotten about that? What it means about his remembering is it's that he's going to act upon what he had said. Not that he had forgotten it, but that the time had come when he would begin to implement all of those things. So again, take a look at what it says in verse 24. Let's read it one more time because there's the word covenant. It says, so God heard their groaning and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. So we know that he had made what he called a covenant. We found that in verse, I think it's 18 of Genesis 15, where God says, this is the covenant that I will make with you and your people and with this land. So it is the land of Israel. It is the people of Israel. It is the sons of Abraham. And those would be the people with whom he made the covenant. And as I mentioned the last time, the nation of Israel and what we would call the Hebrew people at this time, or the Jews, whatever we would like to call them to refer to them, they are the only people that God has ever made a covenant with. And it's also a covenant that he never has changed his mind. There was no shelf life on it. So when he said, I will make of you a great nation, and through you the nations will be blessed. I will bless those who curse you, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. When God said that to him, he didn't say until such a time. That is still in force even to this day. So for those people in the various churches that would teach what we call replacement theology, again, that's just taught through ignorance of the scripture. God never put a shelf life on his promises. Thank God for that. Wouldn't that be horrible for us if he makes promises only to rescind them later? It's ridiculous. So look at verse 25 because it finishes out this section. So God looked upon the children of Israel, and then God acknowledged them, exactly as he promised he would do. So very important for us to understand from this point, the clock, if you will, begins to start ticking. And now God is going to move towards the fulfillment of everything that he had promised that he would do in them. Now, from there, let's go ahead and turn to chapter 19 because it's the next part of this. So in chapter 19, let's take a look at, we'll just read from chapter 19, verse 1. So it tells us again, Exodus 19, verse 1 says, now in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And there, for they had departed from the Rephidim, and they had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and they camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him in the morning at the mountain, saying, thus you will say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So in his meeting with God, God is saying, remember all that I have done at this point. Remembering also what we've just read at the beginning of Exodus, God says, I've remembered, or I'm bringing back to the point where those promises that I made to Abraham are now about to be realized. So part of that is giving this covenant. Look at verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, that's the berith that we looked at last week. If you will do these things, if you will obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you will be a special treasure to me above all people, for the earth is mine, and you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. There are the words, or rather, these are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. And so we know that he goes ahead and does that. Now, we're going to get by chapter 20 of this book, we get the 10 Commandments, but there is so much more that is included in that. Remember that the law, as we would consider it, that's the covenant that's being spoken of here. It is a covenant of how they will govern themselves now that they are in the land. So, though they're not there yet, remember, here's what they're getting. It's really important that we understand the bits and pieces of this. Because remember that they didn't leave Egypt and go directly into the land. Remember that was 40 years, and there's all the reasons for 40 years. In fact, we've taught through this whole section of the scriptures, starting with Leviticus after Exodus here, and really to some extent Exodus. But if you look at everything from Exodus to Leviticus and then to Numbers and Deuteronomy, it explains to you the reasons why they wandered in the wilderness for those 40 years, and it explains the length of that time. So from the time that God leads them out, he brings them then ultimately into the land. Moses gets all the way to the doorstep of it as we study through it, but it is actually Joshua who leads them across the Jordan River, and then they're first encountered there at Jericho. So we have all of these bits of the history for us, but let's remember that what God is giving to Moses here is a law that would govern them through their years of wandering, but it was supposed to also be what would govern them in the time that they are in the land. Now, all we have to do is study the history from the time that God says this to him in the giving of the law in the next chapter until the very time of Jesus, and we will see that the people of Israel did not keep the law as they should have. And that's why they had so many problems throughout their history of fighting with other nations and succumbing to them at times, being wiped out in the northern tribes by Assyria and being taken away in the captivity of the southern tribes to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, returning to the land only to be dispersed by the Romans after Jesus' time. So we can go back and look at all that history. It's really, really interesting. It's important. It's not really the topic for today. Again, we're looking at covenants. These are the agreements that God makes with man. They are always from him to man. It's not that man says, God, I want to make a deal with you. I want to make an agreement. I want to do something with you. It's God coming to people and saying, this is what I propose to do. Here's what I offer to you. So to Abraham, a people and a land. And to Moses, it's since you are the descendants of Abraham, and I've already given him this promise here. Here is the land. You are the people. Now here is how you will walk and be in fellowship with me. This is how you will govern yourselves. It's based upon what I am instructing you to do. So the law is God's instruction to his people in the land. Now, it is important for us to remember, in case I forget to do it later, let me just do it now. So often we will have people who will look at us as believers, and they will kind of mock what we believe, and they're looking back at things that might be in the law. And so they'll mock us saying, okay, well, I guess you don't eat shellfish. And do you stone your kids when they get out of line? And do you kill them for doing that? And, do you, all the things that they love to point out and say, well, you're hypocrites. You say that you believe in the whole Bible, but you don't do this. Things that are according to the law, especially the things that would be seen as punitive. The putting to death of homosexuals and, people that are immoral and all that kind of stuff. So the thing that they fail to ever understand, whether they even know it or not, they don't realize that the laws that were given to the people at this time were for those people at that time, people under the law. So oddly enough, they're expecting us as Christians that we're supposed to somehow fulfill all the elements of the law, and yet that's never what we have been asked to do. In fact, in this place, God never said, I'm expecting the whole world to keep my law. It's only those who desire to walk with me. They will keep my law and they'll walk in fellowship with me. If they don't, they're cut off. And so, that was, again, for a time, how he did the things that he did. In the person of Jesus, he is the one who kept all of the law. And we'll look at that as we get to the third part of this in the next one of these, the installments, if you will, of it. So let's go back to Moses, let's go back to Joshua, and let's go back to them coming into the land. Once they get into the land, then, as it says, you're going to be a kingdom of priests. So we know that the law was not only about, you shall not or you shall, the 10 commandments, but we also know that God instituted a priesthood and a series of offerings, and when they were to be offered, what was to be offered, what was to be the condition of the people when they did offer, and if they were offending God, then what was to be done as remedy. All of that was spelled out in vivid detail. Now, again, when we get to next week, we'll take a look at how that led us, everything that we read here, leads us to the person of Jesus Christ. So I don't want to get too far ahead. I want to leave that for next week because it's very important. And we know that Jesus uses the term, the covenant that he makes with us, and he explains about what that is. Now, in the covenant with Moses, the idea of sacrificing, and that as far as needing to atone for someone's sin, that was going to be done by an offering, and innocent blood would be shed on behalf of the guilty to take care of the issue of sin. That's an Old Testament matter. So oftentimes we will hear that the Bible is not relevant to us in the Old Testament sense, so we don't spend a lot of time teaching that, some churches would say. We only look at the New Testament. And I'm frustrated by that when I hear it, because it means that you don't even understand the covenant that we currently live in here, because it's based upon the old one. And what I mean by that is that even those people that would make that case, frankly, between you and me, I think it's because they're lazy scholars, if it's pastors that would say it, and it is their lack of understanding of what's in the Old Testament. Because what we know in the person of Jesus is that he offered himself as a ransom for us, and he shed his blood to forgive us of our sins. That's not just a New Testament matter. In fact, Jesus said all of those things as an observant Jewish man under the law. Jesus was born into the law. So we would say that he died for the sin of mankind, and he was a substitute for us. He took upon himself that which we were guilty of. Well, that's Leviticus chapter 1, first 2 or 3 verses, is that 4 verses maybe. And it's basically the same thing, is that the person, knowing that they have sinned against God, would have to bring an offering to the priest at the tabernacle in the wilderness. And that person was going to have to do it of his own free will, and it was going to be an animal that was going to be sacrificed on his behalf because of what he had done. And it says that man will put his hand on the head of the animal as a way of acknowledging my guilt for this animal's innocence, and it would be put to death, and its blood would be shed as an atonement for that man's sin. Read it for yourself. It's in the first few verses of the first chapter of the book of Leviticus. What you have there is atonement by blood done by something else on behalf of the person who is guilty. In the person of Jesus, we have the perfect. It's not an animal. It is a real live human flesh and blood person who was perfect. God in the flesh gave himself as a sacrifice for mankind, and his perfect blood was a perfect sacrifice once and for all for mankind. So do you see how that works? Without the old covenant, the new one doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and Jesus says as much in the upper room. We're going to get to that next week. But think about this. There is no covenant with Moses if there's not first the covenant with Abraham, because that's the promise of the people. Without Abraham, there is no Moses. Literally, because Moses clearly comes from the line of Abraham. These are Levites, son of Jacob, Levi, one of them. And so you get it? Hopefully you're catching all of this. If you didn't already know it, I'm hoping that this helps. So with that said, let's go ahead and look at the next one. It's actually the last of the passages that we'll look at, and it's chapter 24 of the book of Exodus. Exodus 24. What we will look at here is let's look at verse 3. Now, remember, we were told that he was supposed to tell the people everything that he had heard. So a few chapters go by, and now here Moses is reading to the people all the things and recounting for them all the things that God had said. And so we get in verse 3, so Moses, he came and he told the people all the words of the Lord and all of the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice, all the words which the Lord has said we will do. Now that sounds great. I'm sure that they intended to do that. But we know from history that that is not at all what happened. They were rebellious people. So that's why they wandered around in the wilderness for those 40 years. Verse 4, Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. He wrote them down. They're in a volume. We have them, obviously. So he rose early in the morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins. Half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And then he took the book of the covenant and he read it in the hearing of the people. That's the things. The book of the covenant is what God had revealed to him to that point and told him to write down. Now, again, this is before he's going to get all of the details about the priesthood and all the rest. He knows of offerings and all that. That's beginning to take place here, but there's still so much more of the law and the sacrifices and when they would be offered and how they would be offered. There was still so much to learn in this, and it was going to be revealed, and this book would have things added to it. Again, it's what we now know as the books that follow this. From Exodus, from this point in Exodus on, when we get to Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, those are all of the additions, the things that God further instructed the children of Israel. All of this because of the promise that God made first and foremost to Abraham. So, reading on, verse 7, he took the book of the covenant, read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all the things that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. And only if they had done it, right? Verse 8 says this, so Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and he said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord makes with you according to all these words. And boy, oh boy, this is the blood of the covenant. Does that not sound somewhat familiar to us as far as we know what Jesus said in the upper room? Was it a mistake? Was it just coincidental? Not hardly. Of course, because he says it's a new covenant that Jesus will talk about when we see that in the next session of this. It'll be the third part of these three parts, and we'll look at what Jesus had to say. And again, without the recognition of the covenant of Abraham to the covenant of Moses, we wouldn't really understand any of what Jesus was saying, let alone when he said it. He said it the night of the last night of his freedom, and he was there in Jerusalem at the Passover. Well, what was the Passover other than a remembrance that happened every single year of the Exodus and God giving this ministry, if you will, to Moses to lead the people under the law as they come back to their land. So you see how they're just so interconnected. They're not three independent covenants that have nothing to do with one another. They are the way that God has ministered to and through his people through the ages, all with one intent, to lead us to the person of Jesus Christ. We'll look at what Paul had to say about that to the Galatians and a few other things in the next one of these. But I want us to understand what a bridge the time of Moses and Joshua is from Abraham to the person of Jesus. This is the in-between part of it. And let's remember again, Abraham walked with God by simply faith. I believe in the promises that God has made to me, though there's nothing, if you will, that was codified and written down to Abraham. That happened with Moses. So Moses gives them the written law, as God says, write these things down, and then they have this codified written law by which they would conduct themselves. And so they walked with God according to the law. By the person of Jesus, we now come back to faith. From Abraham, faith, Moses, the law. In Jesus, we have grace and truth. And we walk with him by faith because we trust him and the promises that he made. So we'll get to that next week. But again, I really want to make sure we understand the bridge. And ultimately, if you remove any one of these three, the whole story falls apart, or the whole narrative, if you will, completely falls apart because they are dependent one upon another. Both of them lead us to the person of Jesus, which we will look at. Hopefully you're starting to see the connection in all these things because they're very, very important for us. And they help us in what I would call theology, or what I would refer to it as theology. When we talk about these doctrines and all the rest of it, we teach them based upon the theology of God makes agreements with men, and he leads them, and he has bigger plans than any of them could ever possibly know. From Abraham onward, God deals with his people, and he does things in and through them for reasons that are only known to him at the time. They just have to be revealed. But boy, think about all of that. Here we are in 2021, and we get a chance to take a look back at basically 4,000 years of history from Abraham's time onward, and really make sure that you understand this. It is such an integrated thing that from the time that Jesus offers himself as a sacrifice for the sin of mankind, it's perfectly in keeping with everything said since chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, all the way to our time, because we see it through the eyes of the cross and through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Looking back at all of what had happened in the Old Testament, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those things. Again, we'll look at that next week, but it's hugely important, especially if we're trying to tell people why we believe what we believe, and we want to make sure that we never do violence to the Old Testament in any way, that we take the time to understand what it teaches and know it fully in order to use it as an ability to say, here's why we believe what we believe. So we'll pick up next week on the third part of this, the covenant that Jesus has made in his own blood, is using his words in this. And again, if there are any questions that come up as a result of last week or the first part of this or this part, then please contact us through the website that we have, which is Old Path Theology. And you can contact us through the email link that's there. You just click on contact and it sends that to you. Or you can send that rather to us, and I'd love to answer any of those. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we do a lot of these talking points, and we also do through the Bible studies in the Old Testament and the New Testament at all times. During the week, we have one where we're going through the Old Testament, that's on Mondays, and one that we're going through the New Testament, that's on Thursdays, so that you're able to study all the way through the entirety of the Old and New Testament. So with that said, we'll pick up at part 3 next week, and I hope that you've enjoyed this. Again, if you have questions, please contact us and let us know.